Alors on peut commencer avec quelques minutes de retard. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Avant de commencer et laisser la parole à nos invités, je vais dire quelques mots au nom du comité d'organisation de la conférence. Donc depuis plus de 20 ans, Historical Materialism réunit chaque année des chercheurs et des militants de nombreux pays. C'est la première fois que la conférence a lieu à Paris. Donc ça n'a pas été sans obstacle, mais nous sommes vraiment contents et je pense aussi très fiers de voir ce colloque démarrer et surtout de vous voir si nombreux et nombreux. Le nombre de participants montre bien qu'il existe un réel intérêt pour le marxisme. Nous avons reçu près de 1000 propositions de communication et vous êtes environ 1500 personnes en tout à s'être inscrits pour la conférence. Mais cela témoigne aussi, il me semble, d'un besoin de théorie politique et de savoir qui ne soit pas détaché de la pratique, qui soit véritablement en lien avec les mouvements sociaux. Nous avons choisi pour titre de cette conférence « Conjurer la catastrophe ». En effet, la gravité du contexte s'est une nouvelle fois confirmée. Le comité d'organisation de Historical Materialism Paris a dû faire face à diverses pressions qui ont menacé la tenue même du congrès. Plus grave encore, certains participants et organisations prévues au programme ont été visés par des pressions politiques visant à les censurer, à raison notamment de leur engagement militant, écologiste, antifasciste et surtout antiraciste, ainsi que de leur dénonciation du génocide en cours à Gaza. Pour ne pas les nommer, ces organisations sont les Soulèvements de la Terre, l'Action antifasciste Paris-Banlieue et la camarade militante décoloniale Ouria Boutelja. Nous nous sommes efforcés de chercher des solutions alternatives, mais nous n'avons pas réussi, dans un délai si court, à trouver une salle prête à accueillir toutes leurs interventions et notamment à accueillir une parole antiraciste. Nous l'avons écrit dans un communiqué, mais je le répète ici, en tant que comité d'organisation, nous exprimons notre solidarité avec toutes les personnes qui ont été ciblées par ces pressions inacceptables et nous reviendrons plus en détail sur ces attaques dans un communiqué qui va suivre la conférence. Tout cela montre d'ailleurs à quel point cette conférence est aujourd'hui plus nécessaire que jamais. Merci encore à toutes et à tous d'être là et très bonne conférence à tout le monde. Donc c'est un peu bizarre, mais maintenant je...
Hi everyone, just for those of you who don't understand French, Carlotta has just read a few words that were written by the organizing committee of this conference, where they not only thank you all for being here and explain that this is really a success for the conference, but also that they were under severe pressure and censored from the university here that didn't allow specific organizations and one activist to be part of this conference. They did their best to find solutions, and you will see throughout the program that there are solutions that were put in place, even if they are not the best and everything didn't end up being as they would have wished. They are conscious that the necessity of this conference is more alive than ever, and they thank you all for being here.
Parfait, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Donc je change maintenant de casquette et aussi bientôt de langue pour ouvrir donc cette première session plénière qui portera, comme tout congrès marxiste qui se respecte, sur les transformations du capitalisme contemporain. Donc nous parlerons en particulier du rôle que jouent les infrastructures matérielles et non matérielles, immatérielles, dans les actuelles restructurations capitalistiques. Je vais donc maintenant passer à l'anglais pour lancer cette plénière. And so to kick off the discussion, we are very pleased to welcome the contribution of Cécilia Rikap, that you already met, who is a lecturer in international...
I didn't tell you. It's my fault. I had to answer that email and I didn't have time. I'm associate professor in economics and the head of research at University College London's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose.
Thank you. And Sandro Mezzadra, who teaches political theory at the University of Bologna and that is involved in several projects, including the very recent launch of a new political journal, Teiko, which is rooted in the Italian tradition of the operaism. So, Maya Pal, who was meant to take also part in this panel, won't unfortunately be here and to able to join us due to health issues. So let's begin with the first question, which is not a small one. I don't know which one of you would like to start. Okay, so woman first. So how would you say we can best understand the nature of current capitalism restructurings, especially the way in which economic and political powers are intertwined? For example, do you still think it makes sense to talk about neoliberalism? And what are your thoughts on recent emerging terms like techno-feudalism or techno-fascism? So thank you.
Okay, thanks Carlotta for this question. It actually allows me to go one step back and give you a sense of context also. Everyone, of course, is familiar with those pictures with Elon Musk and the other CEOs from big tech companies at the inauguration day of the second turn of Trump in government. And it is definitely not a novelty that these companies are governing capitalism. What I think where the question lands is whether in the end it's about the US state deciding and these companies bending their knee, or the other way around, these companies are the shadow cabinet or those, the underlying rulers of the US government. And I will actually suggest that it's a bit of both and that they have a very complex interplay. But in order to arrive at that part of my answer, I first want to say what that inauguration day doesn't mean. It's not that these companies were sitting, or the CEOs and founders of these companies were sitting there because of lobby. Of course, they do a lot of lobby, and they are the largest lobbyists in the world, in Europe, in the US, but it was not mainly because of that. It's not because of all the money that these billionaires have. Actually, what we need to do is to explain the origin of that money. Why are they so rich? And this directly speaks, can you hear me properly? You need it? I'm not in the camera. Ah, it's okay. I think I don't need to be in the camera. Okay. I was not paying attention to that. I'm sorry. I will look at this camera. So I was saying, if we ask ourselves, why are they so rich? We are basically starting to ask ourselves the right question, which is, what do their companies represent for global capitalism today? And an easy answer could be just to say that basically from their platforms and cloud, they are structuring how knowledge is produced, how it is disseminated, who knows what and how. They also control discourses. So basically, they even control how we think about AI. If we have a definition about AI, it's because this is the definition that they crafted. And they even craft narratives about the effects of regulation, of regulating AI, of regulating them or terminating their power, from saying that regulation stifles innovation, which assumes that every type of innovation is intrinsically good and that innovation will lead to growth and growth to progress. A lot of assumptions being made in this chain of thoughts that are that once we start unpacking them, we realize that all this is just a crafted narrative. And they also control narratives when they say that they shouldn't be regulated or they should be less regulated because actually Chinese leading corporations and China are the ultimate real threat. And this is why they should be actually thanked, because they exist, and because of them they are saving democracies or the way you want to name it. So why? How was it that these companies ended up even dictating how we think about the world, and in particular since generative AI, because they definitely exercise what I would describe as epistemic totalitarianism, in the sense that they define even what are the questions to be asked, what's the research agenda, not only for computer sciences, but for fields more broadly. And this is something that also other leading corporations do. Think of big pharma companies, for instance. They also dictate the research agenda, but in this case, for health and biomedical sciences. And we can think of similar things for other industries where leading corporations are the ones in command. And they are in command because there is one thing that they all have in common, and is what I would define as the capacity to exercise intellectual monopolies. And this doesn't mean simply that they are one-time innovators, doesn't mean necessarily that they are the innovators. It means that they are systematically capturing knowledge, data, narratives, and turning them into their intangible assets. And on that basis, they control spheres of society. Examples go from global value chains and how a company like Apple controls the iPhone global value chain, or NVIDIA, the AI semiconductor global value chain, to the franchising model of a company like McDonald's, that also, on the basis of its intangibles, is capable of controlling thousands, almost 100,000 of franchisees around the world. So the first thing that we have to look at is at the production of intangibles. Who is producing knowledge in our society and who is capable of profiting on the basis of capturing that knowledge? Intellectual monopolies have a capacity today, in today's capitalism, to control what I describe as corporate innovation systems. These are integrated by thousands of organizations. Knowledge is produced collectively by universities, public research organizations, startup companies, diverse leading corporations. Of course, I'm not saying that these companies are not themselves also developing part of the science and technology that then ends up being their assets. But I'm just saying that they are not the only ones doing it, and that knowledge is not produced inside their R&D laboratories exclusively, but actually at the level of international spaces. And in these international spaces, many contribute, but only these companies profit in the end, or disproportionately profit. And when it comes to generative AI, the situation is even worse, and to AI in general, because these companies have a capacity to directly control the whole AI research field. And I will show you something. I will not go into very technical details here, but I will show you something so that you see that it's not just me speaking here because I dislike the companies or anything like that. Okay, you cannot see it completely. It doesn't matter, and actually from the back probably you cannot see a thing, but just for you, if you're interested, I can show this. No worries. I can show this to you later on. But what you can see here is a map of the top 150 organizations in terms of how frequently they were presenting their research in the most important AI conferences in the world between 2018 and 2020. These are the organizations that set the research agenda in artificial intelligence. And you can see clearly that at the center of the network, which is surrounded by squares, one square cannot be seen because of the translation, but it's also there. And you can see Microsoft on top inside the blue square. So inside the two squares, we have Microsoft and Google. And other big tech companies are also occupying a center stage in this map. This means that these corporations are the ones not only dictating what their direct co-authors, the direct organizations that whose research they are funding, or the people they are directly working with are investigating, but this means that they have the capacity to influence the whole AI research agenda. So even if there is a group of researchers at the INRIA, for instance, here in France, they don't receive money from big tech, they are not doing any type of collaboration with these companies, the research that they will be developing will still be the research that these companies want, because the research agenda is set according to their priorities. When it comes to capturing this knowledge, these are companies also, I was saying before, that disproportionately capture it, and probably this will also land beneath the translation, but it's okay. You just need to continue believing me. And what I'm showing there is a simple comparison. What percentage of the papers that are co-authored by Microsoft with another organization that is not Microsoft, or the percentage that the co-authorships of Microsoft represent in terms of all the publications that Microsoft has done. So between 2012 and 2021, from the over 15,000 scientific publications that had at least one author signing, I work for Microsoft. So as I sign in my affiliation, University College London, in 15,000 publications, there was at least one person saying, I work for Microsoft. From that total, almost 90% of the publications had a co-author that was not from Microsoft, which means that almost every single piece of research that comes out from Microsoft actually was not done exclusively by Microsoft, but also by other organizations. And once we compare that with the share of co-ownership of patents, which, believe me, is far from the only and not necessarily the main appropriation mechanism of this company, so the main way in which these companies transform the knowledge into an intangible asset, anyway, we look at the share of co-owned patents, so to what extent they are sharing the ownership of their patents, and the percentage is 1%. 90% of the research done with others, 1% of the patents shared with others. One could think, okay, this is just the level of research, but then after research, we have all the open source community, we have all the startups doing their own things in AI, so it's not that the whole industry is captured by these companies. And nonetheless, and I will try to go fast here, if we go and start studying the open source environment, we will see that this has also been conquered by big tech companies. It's not only because they can profit from free labor, which they do. Just as an example, 41% of the contributions to TensorFlow is a machine learning library, so it's part of the, if you want, inputs that are used to produce AI. So 41% of the contributions to TensorFlow, which was originally a proprietary software owned by Google, but that then Google decided to put in open source, this 41% represents the number of contributions that were not from Google. So 4 in 10 contributions to TensorFlow didn't come from Google. So clearly, they profit from free labor. But was this the ultimate reason why they put TensorFlow in open source? No. The ultimate reason is that when they put in open source a piece of their software, they can create an ecosystem around it. Because it's not proprietary, in principle, nobody has to pay to use it, so it's easier to adopt. So they create de facto standards, they rule and norm how the software community works, and more developers start using, in my example, TensorFlow. This is what Mark Zuckerberg would like to have with the models Llama, and it's basically what he's saying here on the screen in this snippet that comes from one of the Meta's results hearings. So when they are communicating to the shareholders their business results, he was clearly telling the shareholders, hey, don't think that I'm crazy because I have put Llama models in partial open source, actually, not fully, because there are many reasons, there are many business reasons that explain why this is the right strategy. So they control the 2 spaces of production of public knowledge, in the case of AI, and more broadly, I would argue digital technologies, and they also control startups. And here I will just explain on the top of the screen, you have a table with the top 10 funders of AI startups by February 2024. Google was number 3rd and Microsoft the 10th in the number of companies that were receiving investments from these organizations. So they play at the same league as the Sequoia Capital, Y Combinator, and so on and so forth. So they are venture capitalists as well. But the financial gain is not what drives them, or at least it's not the main driver. The main driver, as Mistral, who just is the first time I think that I say this in France. A Mistral interviewee told me the reason for this is that they get a sort of double dip. They can, on the one hand side, get privileged access to the technologies that the startups are developing, and at the same time, they lock in the startups, and they look in every type of organization. And they do that because part of this money comes in the form of cloud vouchers. And everybody knows that the cloud is infrastructure as a service. That data centers from companies like Microsoft, Amazon, and Google offer the processing power that then smaller companies like OpenAI or Anthropic and many more use for processing, training their AI models. But what is less known is that the cloud is actually digital technology supermarket. Every single digital technology today is being produced, exchanged, and consumed on the cloud. For an economist like myself, this is definitely relevant because it's not that we have three separate spaces, the production unit, the market, and then the household where things are consumed. What we are actually witnessing is that all of this happens in one space, the cloud. And of course, the cloud doesn't only sell services that are developed by the leading corporations that control them, which again are Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. The cloud also sells thousands of services that were individually produced by different companies, startups, and many others, not only small companies, that every time that they sell their services, they need to pay to Amazon, Microsoft, or Google. And all these services are sold as black boxes, which means that people can use the service, but they cannot, organizations can use the service, but they cannot really get access, again, to the code or the technology. And this is done on purpose also by these companies, and I can then further unpack it. But let me go now to governments. And here, you have, for instance, Satya Nadella, who is Microsoft CEO, celebrating that the UK government has signed a 5-year agreement with Microsoft to, and I read what's out there, to support a new era of digital transformation. When a government migrates to the cloud, the effect is the same of every other company or every other organization, for instance, a company or a university, which is that they end up locked into the cloud. Governments use the cloud not only for accessing services for the military, which they do, and the US government is dependent on digital technologies for the US Department of Defense that are provided by companies like Microsoft and Google, and the number of contracts with companies like Microsoft and Google has increased over the years, also with Amazon. But for these companies, for Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, a military contract with the US government is not a big business. It ends up being pocket money. And for these companies as well, who control the technologies that then are indispensable not only for the military, but for the everyday operations of every government, think about hospitals, think about universities, think about the everyday functioning of the state, these technologies are crucial. So when we go back to the question about the relation between corporate and political power today, of course, every single government in the world that is not the US government, neither the US government nor the Chinese government, will be observing their sovereignty severely hampered. Because essential technologies for their operations, from things like national security to how they run on a daily basis, will be dependent on technologies that they do not control, that they do not understand. And so in the end of the day, it's not only about the data and the fact that these companies may eventually give the government's data or citizens' data to another government, but it's about the technological dependencies that this generates. And what about, and I finished this answer there, what about the US government, for instance, or the Chinese government? Because I was not speaking about Chinese companies, but a sort of similar picture is taking place there with, of course, its own specificities. So, of course, for these companies, having the support of the US government in a context where there are more attempts to regulate their power, it's important. And we shouldn't wonder why, after, for instance, the European Union developing the DMA, the DSA, the AI Act, and so on and so forth, for these companies, it became even more relevant to align with the US government, be it Trump, be it whoever had won the election. But at the same time, for the US government, it's dangerous to depend on these companies. And I think that it's through that lens that we need to think about corporate and political power today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. So I give the floor to Sandro to...
Yes, thank you very much. So the main question asked by Carlotta regards the nature of contemporary capitalism. And let me say that We have been struggling for decades now to grasp the specificity of the contemporary capitalist formation. Post-Fordism, cognitive capitalism, financialization, logistical capitalism. The list could go on with dozens other labels. And each of these labels, in a way, grasped an aspect of contemporary capitalism, but we have to admit that capitalism today is so protean that it is difficult to provide kind of full-fledged definition. Having said this, allow me to say that today it is difficult for me to talk about capitalism without talking about the war, without talking about the conjuncture of war we are living through. Ukraine war, the ongoing genocide in Gaza, Israel's and US attacks on Iran. Each of these wars has its own history, but the point is that they concatenated to form what I was calling provisionally a conjuncture of war. And this conjuncture of war with respect to capitalism raises complex issues of imperialism, hegemony, and the organization of global spaces. The current conjuncture of war points above all at the existence of deep fractures in the world market, in the capitalist world market. And so we should look at contemporary capitalism from this angle, emphasizing, for instance, monetary and financial turmoil or the tensions surrounding relations between debtor and creditor countries. But saying this for me does not mean to propose a kind of geopolitical reframing of the critique of political economy. The opposite is the case. The point for us today is to work, to connect this dynamics of war and militarization with an analysis of the way in which contemporary capitalism works, and above all, with an emphasis on the lines of antagonism that continue to crisscross it. So which kind of developments within capitalism have facilitated the emergence of the current conjuncture of war? This seems to me a crucial question for us today. And we should also connect this question to an attempt to understand the new forms of authoritarianism and fascism that became apparent already in the wake of the financial crisis in 2007 and 2008. So I repeat, which developments within capitalism should we emphasize regarding their role in facilitating the emergence of the current conjuncture of war? powerful processes of concentration of capital and power. We heard about such processes right now, are a first relevant factor here, which can be indeed instantiated by huge infrastructural platforms, so-called big tech. And so I come to the issue of infrastructures. And the analysis of the operations of big infrastructural platforms is a good case in point with respect to Carlotta's question on the intertwining of economic and political power. Of course, the accumulation of economic power has always had political implications. We know it, for instance, from Machiavelli. But today, it is clear that we reached a tipping point, a qualitative threshold. And this is because large infrastructural platforms are directly political, governmental bodies, crystals of power established and rooted at the very heart of social cooperation from which they extract and appropriate value. And the shift toward militarization, which is so apparent today, think of Peter Thiel's Palantir, of Elon Musk's Starlink, or Microsoft's role in the genocide in Gaza, is in a way a kind of smooth development of this trend. There was another point in Carlotta's question that I find particularly interesting, the one regarding the concepts, the notions that we use in order to make sense of the current moment of capitalism. And indeed, in a world torn by proliferating literal wars, trade wars, and tariffs, as well as by the processes of concentration of power that I just mentioned, it is difficult for me to continue to use the notion of neoliberalism to grasp the current conjuncture of capital as a whole. Needless to say, neoliberalism is flexible and adaptable, is so protean as contemporary capitalism. Such a notion of human capital continues to spur social and economic policies in many parts of the world, and the same is true for neoliberal education and urban policies. But the neoliberal moment in the global history of capitalism may be over, and certainly not in the best possible way. I conclude with the notions of techno-feudalism, neo-feudalism that were also mentioned by Carlotta. Are they good candidates to substitute neoliberalism? Honestly, I doubt. I get the point in Yanis Varoufakis and Jody Dean's writings, but to put it very quickly, and then we can, of course, discuss, I think they work with an ideal type of capitalism to make the point that it eventually found its neo-feudal grave. The limitless accumulation of capital as a societal norm. If we take this basic definition of capitalism as reference, well, we have to admit that it continues to be a good definition of the world we live in.
C'est pas fini, hein? So thank you very much to the both of us for this first round of answer. Now I'm moving to a second question. So you already gave a lot of elements to respond to this one, but I wanted you to extend a bit on your opinion, to what extent are infrastructure central to the current transformation of capitalism, but also object of political contestation and strategic control. So, for instance, how does issues of sovereignty and dependency play out in this context? Same.
Okay, so I will start just because I didn't have time in the answer before because I was speaking already a lot. I didn't say why I don't use the term techno-feudalism. Some of you may have heard me saying this before, but I think that for this audience, the most important part of my answer is what I'm going to say first, which is that it's not that capitalism was working fine and then one day we woke up and it was techno-feudal and this was the main problem. So I think that the terms we use, especially when we communicate this to larger audiences, are important. And although it's very catchy and it also, I think that it to some extent can make it easier to understand that this is a form of capitalism where rents play a big role, where capture, control, political role by corporations is important. Capitalism was always about all this as well. It was never just about, and it was actually never about commodities exchanging on their value. This is chapter 1 of a 3-volume piece of work that was still incomplete and that was written over 150 years ago. So really, I think that we need to understand capitalism's mutations, see what remains and how things change, and on that basis, recognize that capitalism has always been about exploitation, appropriation, subordination of a majority, and that we need to contest it in all its forms. Having said this, I would, from a more academic perspective, if you want, I would emphasize the part that refers to rents and control. I come from Argentina, and there, both ground rent and also technological rents, intellectual rents, have always been important for and crucial, I would say, for understanding capital accumulation in our region. And if you think about the dependency theory and how it was structured, what they were explaining is underdevelopment would never be solved as long as there is a technological monopoly in the hands of companies from core countries. So I think that we still need to speak about capitalism. I wouldn't reduce it to infrastructural power. I think that, again, the term infrastructure can be very easy to grasp and understand. These companies lie beneath everything, and on top of their platforms, whatever we look at, every other digital service ends up lying on their clouds. It's true that unlike many other leading corporations, they not only invest a large share of their revenues in R&D, they invest an equally large share in capital expenditure, precisely to concentrate more undersea cables, to concentrate more data centers. But if we just limit our understanding to the concentration that is exercised, both of tangibles and intangibles, that is exercised by these companies, we miss what, for me, is the key transformation of our time, which is the capacity to control capital accumulation beyond ownership. So if I have to give only one sentence to my answer, that would be, for me, the first takeaway for everyone. Capitalism today is about control beyond ownership. It's about control beyond the market where the company is directly selling. But of course, those controlling beyond ownership are not every single individual capital, because there are many individual capitals that are subordinated, that are the subject of the control relationship. So if we think in terms of control beyond ownership, it's not so much about the infrastructural power, but it's about where a company is positioned within networks. So I would argue that the capacity to exercise a bottleneck or the capacity to have a panopticon view of the global economy, regardless of whether that is based on an infrastructural power or a different type of bottleneck, NVIDIA doesn't have infrastructural power in itself. It has a bottleneck. It has a bottleneck for something that goes in the processing power of everything that wants to afterward, that is used for training models, AI models in general, for instance. So I think that there, what ends up, or where we need to go is to see why is it that the control over the digital technologies global value chain is so important? Why is it that controlling a value chain of all the organizations that are producing digital services is, for instance, more important than how big pharma companies control also global value chains that produce new drugs or existing drugs? Why is it that that seems to be more relevant for capital accumulation? And my reply to that is that these are control technologies. Digital technologies are the ICT technologies of our time. They are control technologies for the workplace, to control workers. They are also control technologies to control one country over another. They are control technologies when we think in terms of how consumers are controlled, and the specificity of digital technologies compared to previously existing control technologies, previously existing ICT technologies, is that today control can be tailor-made. So because we know exactly how you consume, I can persuade you to consume more according to your profile. Because I know exactly how you work, I control you better and define what your new goals will be in the future on the basis of the information that I have individualized about you. So on this basis, if we go to what could be done and what is being done, yes, in my research and in my discussions, both with policymakers and activists, I have gathered tons of examples. There is one that I like a lot, for instance, in Germany, in order to prevent data centers to be installed, they climb on the trees. Because there is apparently a law that says that you cannot be kicked out of a place if you're on top of a tree. So basically, they climb trees and they stay there. And if they were to protest and to make sure that the data center is not installed. And there is also another initiative that is in Spanish, is very sweet. The phrase is, tu nube seca mi río, which means your cloud dries my river. And it's precisely an initiative to raise awareness about the effects of installing, again, data centers on communities in terms of the use of water, electricity, and so on. And I think that all these initiatives, all these ways of contestation are, of course, important, but they are far from enough. Because control technologies will not disappear. What we need to do is to democratize who is in control of those technologies. It's not that we can terminate them. We cannot just say, tomorrow we will end every form of digital technology. They will not go away. One thing about these control technologies is that consumers love them. We are a lot in this room, but we are a minority in the world. So most of the people in the world fulfill desires with these technologies. And we also need to understand that that's a way to control them as well, but we cannot neglect it. So we need to think of an alternative that is not just trying to terminate technologies, because that's a rabbit hole. And this is why, with different colleagues, we've been thinking about how to expand digital sovereignty, and we've been discussing this with many governments, not because we blindly believe in these governments. It's because we think that they're institutions that at least should be made accountable. In most countries in the world, those in power are elected democratically. And in principle, they should be serving their citizens. So exposing the effects of the control of these technologies by a few corporations, coming in particular from the US and secondarily from China, is a way to also make them accountable for leading the development of an alternative. An alternative that, again, needs to go beyond regulation, beyond contestation of these technologies, and that should actually put these technologies in the hands of people. And it's not just about usage, it's about who produces the technologies, who asks the question about what technologies will be developed, for what, for whom, how can we make this development of digital technologies, or whether we can make the development of certain digital technologies compatible with an ecological crisis. I think that all these questions need to be answered in the most democratic way, that all this knowledge needs to remain public, but at the same time we need to have the mechanisms to prevent the private appropriation of this knowledge, because I was showing you before how they capture public knowledge in all its forms. So I think that actually my overall take is quite pessimistic, even if I do see contestation. I do see also from certain progressive governments or leftist governments in some parts of the world an aim to do something. They are also being significantly captured by these companies, and I can further unpack later on if you're interested. Thank you.
Well, the question regards the position of infrastructures within contemporary capitalism. I think Cecilia already made some important points. In a way, she also explained that the distinction between digital and physical infrastructures must be handled with care, because digital infrastructures are predicated upon not only giant physical infrastructures like data centers and submarine cables, but also on an expansion of extractive activities of critical minerals. I think that what I can say following up on my first intervention is that the crucial role of infrastructures is also apparent looking at current wars, at the current conjuncture of war. Take, for instance, the regional dimensions of the war in the greater Middle East, which are crisscrossed by huge infrastructural projects, such as the US-led India-Middle East-Europe economic corridor, the China-Iran rail project that is part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and the Iraq-Turkey Central Corridor, as it is called. So I do not want to reduce the dynamics of war in the region to the competition between these projects, but they definitely play a role. And while this is, of course, not something new, it demonstrates the relevance of infrastructures in contemporary capitalism, as well as the salience of the issues of sovereignty and dependency that Carlotta mentioned. In more general terms, there is a need to note that the meaning of infrastructures has been stretched and expanded because of the necessary integration of the digital dimension, while such a notion as infrastructures of care has increasingly attracted attention. So the meaning, the very meaning of the notion of infrastructure has changed over the last years. And at the same time, the study of infrastructural spaces has entered the agenda of urban and global studies. I think that what lies behind the widespread use of a phrase, of a label, like infrastructural capitalism, is an increasing awareness of the multifarious roles played by social cooperation even beyond what presents itself as labor, in spurring processes of valorization of capital. Believe me, I am not proposing a simplistic or naive image of cooperation. The opposite is true. I'm fully aware of the hierarchies and violence crisscrossing social cooperations. Infrastructures, in general terms, intervene precisely within these hierarchies and violence, creating the conditions for a capitalist valorization of social cooperation, and that usually take the form of an extraction of value. Digital platforms are again a good instance here. Should I go on and conclude? Or So this is not to say, I conclude in 2 minutes, that all infrastructures necessarily perform this function, or that we should oppose all of them. The opposition, the struggle against specific infrastructural projects is certainly necessary, and we have plenty of examples of powerful movements in this respect. But the problem remains that we need our infrastructures, that we have to struggle to imagine combinations of planning and self-government to prompt what I would like to call a communist transition. And to do that, I repeat, we need our infrastructures.
So this is turning into an horror movie. And now I move to my third and last question, and then we will open the floor to questions. So what you have said brings me to my final question, which is, sorry, I don't read well. No, mais ça va, ça. Is capitalism for you increasingly centered around the two great powers, China and the United States, or at the contrary, becoming more multipolar? So how can we account for this shift, and how can it be measured? And how might a second Trump presidency introduce further elements into this evolving landscape? So I give the floor to Cecilia again.
So I would first argue that actually it's multipolar, and you would see, okay, you will think, okay, she's a schizophrenic. She has been talking all along about the US and Chinese companies, and now she says multipolar. But this precisely because I was speaking about the US and Chinese companies. If we want to think about poles in global capitalism, we can no longer just think about the US state, the Chinese state. We need also to think of the companies as poles themselves. They control spheres of capitalism. They set the rules within those spheres. They govern even if they were not elected. So my first of 7 points to answer this question is that we need to think of capitalism, global capitalism, and geopolitical questions always in terms not only of states, core states versus peripheral states, but also in terms of where core capital lands and what is core capital is doing. And my second point on that basis will be to say, therefore, if we are just looking into the relation, whoa, okay, we have the light again. If we are only looking at states as the main geopolitical players, we will be very ill-equipped. And I will give you one example. We've been speaking about the genocide in Gaza. One thing to say about the genocide in Gaza is that in part it was enabled by something that is called Project Nimbus. Project Nimbus, for those of you that haven't heard of it before, consisted basically of data centers and a lot of digital services that were provided by Google and Amazon to the Israeli state. What for? Well, to exterminate Palestinians. So perhaps there were also services for other things, but ultimately, for exterminating Palestinians. So I think that we definitely, in every single thing we look at, Ukraine, the role of Starlink, in the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, we should also look at the role of Amazon Web Services. Amazon offering for quote-unquote free its services to the Ukrainian state in the moment when it was weaker than ever. Of course, they offered this for free, and once you migrate the whole operation of the state into AWS, it's impossible to leave. You become completely locked in. The technologies that are used end up defining the type of government that you can have. So my third point is that this is why, instead of poles and just looking at the poles, I would rather speak of cores and peripheries, because this allows us to also look at semi-peripheries and to zoom differently. If we want to see the global economy and think of political cores, and we think of the US and China as political cores, it's not that Europe is the same than Latin America. Although we could include them in the periphery, there are, of course, historical and contemporary differences, which is why thinking in terms of cores and multiple cores or multiple peripheries, even within Europe, is not the same to be in Germany or France than to be Poland. So I think that, again, the core and periphery is useful, and it's not only useful for speaking about the macroeconomic level, for speaking about countries or for speaking about the power of different states. It's also useful for understanding the ways in which capital is structured, for understanding industrial stratification and how we have established core of leading corporations, around them some other leading corporations that are still dependent. So a company like Nestlé is dependent on the technologies offered by Amazon, Microsoft, and Google for planning its own global value chain, for controlling beyond ownerships those that are further below. So I think that in the end, this makes more sense. And speaking about cores and peripheries, and I move to my next point here, is relevant because it also enables me to connect it with dependency theory, which is in the history of Marxism, the branch that has focused greatly in these dynamics. And within dependency theory, there are a few things to highlight to think about today's capitalism that I think that are particularly relevant. One is the idea of complicit actors. In the peripheries, there were already in the 1960s and 1970s complicit actors. In Latin America, these typically dependency theory would speak of the oligarchs, of the capitals associated with the primary sector, with the mining extraction. Today, we still have them, but on top of that, we have other complicit actors that are complicit because they were not contributing to a national project of capital accumulation, but ended up contributing to these core periphery and dependency schemes. Today, the complicit actors are also leading corporations from peripheral regions, from regional platforms to companies here like Siemens or Sanofi or even Mistral. So I think that is relevant because otherwise we risk thinking that the problem is just the US and China and that the rest is okay. And I also think that dependency theory can help us understand another thing, which is the idea of extractivisms. For dependency theory, the extraction of nature was crucial for understanding the dynamics of value capture. Today is not only about the destruction of nature, but also that unlike the 1960s, when most of the knowledge that then was monopolized and used to subordinate the peripheries was produced in the north or in the core, today knowledge is more than ever produced globally. But there is a process of extracting this knowledge, also extracting data, and then turning it into an asset by companies from the cores. So there is not only nature extractivism, which remains, but also knowledge and data extractivism. And it's not simply that they coexist. It's not simply that we have knowledge extractivism and nature extractivism as two independent phenomena. They are actually intertwined. And I would actually define them twin extractivism. And I will give you one example, data centers. When governments completely blinded by the narrative of growth, but also thinking that they need to do something about digital technologies and the fact that everything is concentrated in the US and China, end up trying to attract the installation of data centers to their territories, what they are doing is not only perpetuating their dependency at the level of data and knowledge, because those data centers are, first of all, they are not the place where the technologies are really produced in terms of where labor is for producing them. Those coding the software can be based anywhere in the world. They just connect through the internet. But more importantly, those data centers, as I was saying before, would enable a systematic extraction of electricity and water, and will also be at the expense of communities that are living where they are based. So definitely, digital dependencies that lead governments to, among others, attract the installation of data centers end up fostering nature extractivism. So basically, this twin extractivism reinforces, in the end of the day, under dependency. And my final point regarding to this would be that because precisely corporations are also political actors, we need to think about their relationships with governments as diplomatic relationships. It's not to say that they are always opposed to governments or always bending the knee, again, as I was saying in the beginning of my first intervention, bending the knee to Trump or whoever is governing the United States, but these are rulers in global capitalism, and we need to analyze each of the episodes where they encounter themselves as episodes of that could be both of or either clashes of power or alliances. Either way, it's bad for the rest of the world. Thank you.
So this question about China and the US is very important, of course, and it brings me back to the issue of war that I was discussing at the beginning. I think a very important point regards the fact that we cannot reduce geographies of capital to state geographies. We have to look at the kind of intertwining between different spaces, and we have to acknowledge, as Cecilia was saying, that states are not the exclusive actors. So even talking about multipolarity does not imply for me to imagine that each big state builds a pole. The situation is much more complicated. And taking capitalism as centered around China and the United States indeed reinforces such rhetorics as the new Cold War, a new Cold War that could easily become hot. So I resist buying this vision of a capitalism centered around the US and China. And in the work I do with Brett Nielsen, we take seriously the challenge of multipolarity, considering this notion kind of good description of the world we live in, provided we add the adjectives centrifugal and conflictual. And while we focus our analysis more on processes of pole formation than on already established poles, it is enough to mention such countries like India and Brazil to problematize the idea of a global capitalism centered on the US-China binary. If we then take the BRICS plus, or even more generally, the so-called global south into consideration, then the picture becomes even more variegated due to the high degree of heterogeneity that characterize them. So if you allow me to simplify a complex argument, and I'm happy to talk about that later, I think that one of the main dangers we are confronted with today is the presence of powerful forces, and not only in the West, that work toward the transformation of poles into blocks, into, militarized blocks. I also think that the concept of imperialism should be reframed today to grasp this predicament, while it is clear, I think, that the transformation of poles into blocks facilitates the proliferation of wars. Let me say a couple of words about Trump's second presidential mandate. Not very easy, indeed, I've written an article with Michael Hart in which we contend that Trump's second presidency is foreshadowing what we call a coming post-hegemonic world. Post-hegemonic in which sense? It should be clear that we employ the notion of hegemony following the lead of Giovanni Arrighi, and we suggest that the logic of hegemony that has structured the capitalist world system for 5 centuries may be over. From this point of view, a post-hegemonic world may easily become a nightmare. It's not something positive what I am talking about. We can say that Trump is eventually taking stock of the crisis of the US global hegemony and is aiming at creating a space for the projection of US economic power that is certainly huge, but does not coincide with the globe. And in doing that, he exercises dominance without hegemony, to quote Ranajit Gua, sheer violence. And he raises again the issue of territorial expansion, Panama, Canada, Greenland, combined with the rebordering of economic spaces. This is, of course, just an hypothesis. Things are changing at such a breathtaking pace that we have to remain aware of the provisional character of any hypothesis in this respect. But nonetheless, I think that this image of a kind of militarized multipolarity, internally reinforced by authoritarianism, militarism, and even fascism, haunts us today. And it is an image that, independently of Trump's intentions, verges on war. So how to struggle against this tendency? How to struggle against the war? How to build new international alliances? How to forge a new understanding of internationalism are quite crucial questions for us today. Thank you.
So thank you very much to the both of us, for the both of you, for those insightful and rich answers. We have like 10 minutes left for questions or comments. So raise your hand if you... OK.
Et vous pouvez aussi poser les questions en français si besoin. Éventuellement, on peut traduire ou dans mon cas, je peux répondre en français aussi.
Hi, it's on. I guess I had a question more for Cecilia. I'm curious about thoughts on this. I was wondering about like sort of also partially the limitations of dependency theory to explain a lot of what's happening in the political economy of generative AI. For instance, the Danish government is spending a lot of money on trying to create their own sort of server infrastructures and kind of replicate the same sort of generative AI kind of commodity production, that's presently being planned by venture capital and by big tech. So in some sense, they're kind of doing this in a very kind of domestic sovereignty sort of way, but they're also kind of replicating almost exactly the same patterns. You've got like a Danish GPT and that sort of stuff. And it's a bit of, it's like massive capital waste, right? And I guess, I don't know, there's also historical analogies to this with how planning was done even in the global south, even in the countries that did sort of shut off from the global north, like I guess India and Egypt. And I was curious about your thoughts on this.
Well, precisely on that regard, on what's to be done, is where dependency theory scholars disagreed. And while there were some that thought that it was possible to develop underdeveloped countries within capitalism, there were others that said that that was impossible. What we see these days with those attempts is precisely another example of why in the end of the day, it's impossible. This said, I still think that we need to work seriously on a strategy to overcome capitalism. Just by saying it will not work within capitalism, we are doomed, is very sad, not enough. And from a political standpoint, I would never allow myself and the people around me to just accept that and do nothing. I think the contrary, we need to really think about, more than ever, I would say that we need to build on Rosa Luxemburg's ideas of how to try to think about reforms that are not reactionary and that can contribute to what should be something like a strategy towards socialism or, towards a better way of living, a way of living that doesn't destroy humanity. But still, I think that we can, of course, build on certain concepts from certain authors. And my point to dependency theory was not to say, now we all need to look at dependency, like at the world with the prism of dependency theory, and that will be enough. It's just to recognize that we can rework on certain concepts from authors from the past and update them to make sense of what we are seeing today.
Yes, thank you a lot for the interesting presentations. I have a question to Cecilia about resistance strategies in the digital capitalism. So you mentioned a bit that you're a bit pessimistic, but I'm just wondering, reacting to all that you said about the sovereignty of nations and also consumers loving these new technologies, I could think of like several avenues. So when it comes to services like cloud services or email file storage and so on, do you think it would make sense for nation states or maybe something like the European Union to try to develop their own technologies? Do you think this is a way? Or on the other hand, of course, the states are also a part of capitalism, so maybe we should try something different, like really bottom-up initiatives. I have to say, I'm from the Netherlands, and what's interesting, at our statistics office, we switched to LibreOffice recently from Microsoft Word, so like an open source program because of the rising costs of Microsoft. So maybe it will happen just because Microsoft and this type of service is too expensive. And when it comes to consumers, there are recently trends among also younger people who sort of try to use social media less because of their mental health, because of, it's just basically advertisement everywhere. Do you think leftist movements should support this kind of trend, or do you think it's, well, maybe a dead end because it won't succeed on a mass scale anyway? But you really see people trying to leave social media, use, analog cameras, this type of trends. Thank you.
Okay, there are a lot of things in your question. I will start by, should we encourage European technologies? Would capital be different if it's European? No. So it's not about the nationality of capital. And even though one could still argue that if it's European, it's easier to make it accountable to European laws, and I hear this a lot in Brussels, European values, whatever that means. I think that in the best case scenario, that's not enough, and we've seen with this aim to simplify enforcement, which basically means that the European Commission is not going to enforce its existing regulations. That anyway, in that base case scenario, it's far from enough. What I think that I still think that as leftists, of course, we should encourage people that are trying to do something and battle against these companies in different specific ways. For instance, there is also this campaign that is called Make Amazon Pay, and it's on Prime Days, and it encourages people not to buy on Prime Day, which is particularly harmful for Amazon. There are a lot of things going on, but my point in my intervention when a similar question was raised was to say that all these scattered initiatives are not enough by themselves, and that we have a unique opportunity here. Because what leading corporations are doing today is planning. They plan. We live in capitalism, and the leading corporations, the richest ones, the most powerful ones, what they are doing is not market exchanges. They are planning beyond ownership. They have the capacity to plan spheres of the world. They plan global value chains. They plan the whole franchising model. They plan science and technology in huge international systems with many other organizations. So basically, they are planning the organization of labor in spaces that are not formally, legally part of the organization. If these companies plan, it means that planning was not so bad in the end, was not so inefficient. Actually, what it means is that we have an opportunity to do planning differently, to do democratic planning, to do public-led planning for people that is also aware of planetary boundaries, that contributes contributes to solving the ecological crisis instead of contributing to worsening it. So what I think, and what this proposal that we drafted basically says, is that we need to create this alternative as an ecosystemic alternative. It cannot just be here and there, one solution for here, one solution for there. And basically, I was mentioning before this idea of when I was answering to the question about infrastructural power, I said that for me, it's more relevant to look at power in networks, and therefore to look at the capacity of certain actors to have a choke point in the network, to have a panopticon view of the network, to steer the agenda of the network. On that basis, we identify where we need to have a public solution, even from a market perspective. So basically, when I was saying that the cloud is the space where digital technologies are produced, exchanged, and consumed, I was opening the floor to say, therefore, the cloud needs to be replaced. It cannot be, even for a market economy, I'm not being super revolutionary here, and even for a market economy, if you want to have a sort of leveled playing field where every organization can offer their digital services without following the rules and determinations of Amazon, Microsoft, or Google, that space, the market where the technologies are sold, the production sphere where they are produced, and also the space where they are consumed, should be public and should be publicly governed, but that doesn't mean leaving it in the hands of states only. So we really need also to have imagination in terms of the new institutions that need to be created. It needs to be publicly funded, but it shouldn't be in the hands of specific states, because then, of course, there is a space for autocratic governments, to say the least, to appropriate those solutions. So I think that needs to be replaced. This is compatible with having a lot of companies then offering their digital services on top of this structure. And because in the end, we would be creating a market, but it will be a planned way of creating a market, we also need demand. So the public sector should be the one consuming these digital services. Above all, I think that we need to think of a solution for states. It cannot be that schools, it cannot be that hospitals, it cannot be, as far as I would like to terminate with the departments of defense of every single country and with the military and so on, it cannot be that these technologies are developed and controlled by private companies. So I think that at least one of all these sectors, let's think of schools, should be run completely on a public-led stack. So it's not only about using open source, but it's also about deciding what type of technologies will be developed, deciding and knowing how those technologies are developed, having the code open, but at the same time preventing corporations from capturing it. So I think, yes, of course, a lot needs to be changed, but there is also this window of opportunity, because social and democrats and the right do not fully understand these complexities. So I truly think that there is an opportunity, without saying we are doing democratic planning, to advance in more democratic planning, to offer a solution that expands digital sovereignty, but not balkanizing one government against the other or one country against the other, but as a truly international solution, democratic solution, and ecological solution.
Thank you very much for two very inspiring and interesting perspectives. I would like to come back to the first question of this session, whether we still live in neoliberalism today. And I understood both of you to emphasize that we seem to be witnessing the emergence of a new regime of capitalist accumulation, highly catastrophic in its present state. I would like to maybe ask you to situate this shift historically. Would you say that the present structural transformation from neoliberalism to, let's say, post-neoliberalism is somewhat similar to the structural transformation from Fordism to post-Fordism? Or if not, or if so, what would be the main difference between the earlier one, the one 50 years ago and the one today? Like, what would make it qualitatively different? Thank you.
So thank you for the question. I think the shift we are living through today is not comparable to the crisis of Fordism in the 1970s. Moreover, you use the notion of post-neoliberalism. And this notion has been used quite a lot in the first decade of this century in Latin America to characterize so-called new progressive governments. So it was a kind of positive notion that was, of course, criticized from the left, but nonetheless was kind of grasping some aspects of that particular conjuncture. In the shift we are living through today, there is nothing positive, I mean, unless new mass movements, new social struggles are able to kind of occupy the scene in different parts of the world. I think what is very important to emphasize is the kind of world dimension on the shift of the shifts we are living through. The global dimension is kind of conditioning, influencing transformations within regional and national spaces. Maybe there is a reason to keep the reference to post-neoliberalism from an analytical point of view, you know. If you think, for instance, of the proliferating since the 1980s, postmodernism, post-colonialism, the idea was always that key aspects of modernity, key aspects of colonialism continued to exist, although in a different framework. And this is, in a way, something that is happening also with neoliberalism. I was mentioning human capital, for instance. Very important notion in US-American neoliberalism. Human capital continues to be a very influential notion in many parts of the world, including in many countries of the BRICS and of the so-called Global South. But then urban policies, education politics. I mean, neoliberalism continues to be a crucial component of these policies. What I was trying to suggest is that at a very general level, as a notion able to make sense of the conjuncture of capitalism as such, I don't think that neoliberalism works anymore. War, trade wars, tariffs, monetary turmoil, but also the processes of concentration of capital and power that we both were describing. These are all, factors, processes that are not easy to be combined with the notion of neoliberalism if we take this notion in a kind of meaningful sense.
I want to say a few things. The first one is that I think that there is no possible right answer to that question in this type of setting, because every type of answer would be a reductionism, basically. The question itself is very complex, and it depends. We can address it from so many dimensions that, yeah, we would need much more than a whole panel to discuss it. Nonetheless, I'm going to say two things that I think are particularly relevant for understanding the transformation we are living in right now. The first one is that before, this might be controversial, but before, one could still argue that there was an alternative. It's not that the USSR or Cuba or whatever worked as we would like to, but still, if you think about it, in terms of like the morality of people from the left, I think that there was still a space to say, hey, no, but we can still build better that, or there is still a space to build something different, whereas today capitalism is clearly everywhere. So I think that's a difference regardless of all the things that I was discussing before. And I think this is something we need to learn to live with, in the sense of how to explain that a different world is possible, not only desirable, but also possible, which is a world that has never existed, and in a context where it seems to be the end of the world at the same time. So I think that for us in the left, is way more challenging than before. And I can unpack and I can add things like the low levels of unionization, the extent to which unions are not enough, because a lot of people, like most of the people in the world, not most of the people in the world, but most of the people in the peripheral world are under informality, well, and many more things related to that. That's one part of my answer. The other part, to make it short and perhaps have time for more questions, refers to the specificities of artificial intelligence. Because of the lack of time, I didn't say much about it, but there are a lot of things that need to be said in terms of AI. The first thing is that machine learning in general, so not only generative AI, is, if you think of it as a means of production, is the only means of production that appreciates the more we use it. Because the more data the algorithm processes, the better it gets. So from an economic standpoint, this is completely different from, and we would need to change completely our theories of capitalism that are based on assuming that the means of production depreciate with the use, because there is value that is being transferred to the production of each commodity. But then there is another thing about specifically generative AI that is changing society beyond the economic discussions that we've had today, which is the fact that generative AI undermines critical thinking. Generative AI could become the only, or at least the mainstream method of invention, creation, and thinking. This is also why I think that maybe human capital in the future may not be as relevant, a term that, of course, in itself is already super contaminated by neoliberal jargon, but anyway, it may not be as relevant because you may train yourself a lot, but in the end of the day, it's about how you prompt the algorithm, how you do your work, and whether you're prepared to prompt the algorithm in the right way or not. So I think, and this, the interesting part is that it's not only me saying using generative AI undermines critical thinking. There is even a paper authored by Microsoft researchers saying this, that they did an empirical analysis and they found that confidence in generative AI, and while increasing the use of generative AI, undermines critical thinking. So AI may help us do a lot of things, like this translation, which apparently is not very good, and it said that at one point I said cannabis, for instance. And it can help us do a lot of things. It can be useful sometimes for translations or other things. But certainly, because it's based on our past answers to the world, it will never help us creating a better and new society. It will never help us addressing problems that were not solved before. It will never help us to go beyond the statement of what needs to be done. It will help us following orders. It will make us more docile, more effective in following them. But certainly, it will not help us in transforming and overcoming capitalism. And this is different because this is the first time in history that control technologies are not only used to discipline the execution of labor, but also how those that have the privilege of still think about what they are doing, because we've already, through Taylorism, and since then, we've witnessed this separation between execution and consumption. Those that were still conceiving and still thinking, researchers, journalists, politicians as well, developers, and I can continue naming specific professions, all this different professions that are crucial for thinking of a new society will be transformed also by generative AI. And I think this is, again, unique. But of course, this doesn't reply in full your question. Thank you.
So maybe we stop here. So thank you very much for your contribution and the discussion. And just a reminder that there is another plenary session today, tonight at 7 p.m. Place de la République, la Bourse du Travail, à 19h. Oui. Merci beaucoup.